It all began the night the cathedral bells rang without anyone touching them. His name was Father Gabriel Reyes, 41 years old, priest for 15 years in a small parish in the mountains of Peru. He had devoted his life to God, to serving the poor, to maintaining traditions passed down through 2,000 years of Catholic doctrine. He believed with his whole heart, prayed with genuine devotion, celebrated Mass with reverence that moved even the most cynical. Gabriel was what every priest aspired to be: humble, faithful, certain of his calling. But certainty is fragile when confronted with the impossible. The night it happened, Gabriel was alone in the church. 3 a.m, he could not sleep, had been troubled by dreams for weeks. Dreams where he stood before Christ on the cross, and Christ looked at him with eyes that held not suffering but disappointment, not accusation but sadness, as if Gabriel had misunderstood something fundamental, as if the faith he had built his life upon was constructed on foundation that was cracked. He had come to the church to pray, to ask God for clarity, to beg for peace that would let him sleep through the night without waking in cold sweat, feeling like he had lost something he could not name. The church was dark except for candles burning before the altar. The crucifix loomed above him, Christ's carved face frozen in agony that generations of worshippers had contemplated. Gabriel knelt in his usual pew, began the prayers that were muscle memory after 15 years. Our Father, Hail Mary, Apostles' Creed. Words that had always brought comfort now felt hollow, like reciting poetry in language he no longer understood. Then the bells rang, not the normal ringing, not the pattern used for mass or weddings or funerals. Random notes, discordant, as if invisible hands were striking them without rhythm or purpose. Gabriel stood, heart pounding, walked to the tower door, found it locked as it should be. No one could have entered, no wind strong enough to move bells that heavy. He returned to the nave, and that was when he saw the light. It appeared beneath the crucifix, small at first, blue-white, growing brighter, not coming from any source Gabriel could identify. Not candle flame or moonlight through stained glass, just light appearing from nothing, from nowhere, expanding until it filled the space behind the altar with radiance that should have hurt to look at, but did not. Gabriel should have run, should have called for help, should have done anything except stand frozen, watching as the light condensed, solidified, took shape. The being that emerged was tall, impossibly tall, 9 feet, at least humanoid in basic structure, but wrong in every detail. Limbs too long, joints bending in too many places. Skin that was not skin, but something that resembled polished metal and living tissue simultaneously. It had faced 2 eyes that were larger than human eyes, darker, reflecting light in ways that suggested depth behind them that extended beyond the skull. No nose, just slight opening. Mouth that was barely visible until it moved, and it wore something that resembled robes, not cloth, more like energy woven into fabric. Colors that shifted, patterns that moved, as if the being's clothing was alive, was extension of the being itself. Gabriel's knees gave out. He collapsed under the stone floor, unable to support his own weight, unable to process what stood before him. His mind offered explanations, hallucination, dream, divine vision, demonic manifestation, none fit. This was something outside the categories his theology provided. The being spoke, not with voice that came from its mouth, with sound that filled the church, that seemed to emanate from the walls and floor and air itself. Sound that Gabriel heard with his ears, but also felt in his chest, understood in his mind before his brain could translate acoustic vibrations into words. Do not fear, Gabriel Reyes. I mean you no harm. I come with message, with truth, with answer to questions you have been asking in your dreams. Gabriel tried to speak, could not. His throat was closed. His tongue would not obey. Terror had paralyzed every voluntary muscle. The being moved closer, not walking, gliding, as if gravity was optional. It stopped a few feet from where Gabriel knelt, towering over him, radiating presence that was neither malevolent nor benevolent, but simply overwhelming in its otherness. You are priest, the being said. Statement, not question. You serve the one you call Jesus Christ. You teach his message. You administer his sacraments. You represent his church. Gabriel managed to nod, barely. Small motion that took all the strength. But you do not know who Jesus was. The being continued, what the church has taught, doctrine and dogma and theological constructions built over centuries, but you do not know the truth. The one truth that church is buried so deeply that even most priests do not remember it was hidden. Gabriel found his voice, weak, trembling, but functional. What are you? The being tilted its head, motion that seemed to indicate consideration. I am Travala, observer, keeper of histories. My people have watched your species since you first achieved consciousness. We have recorded your development. We have witnessed your struggles, and we have intervened when necessary, though intervention is against our protocols except in extraordinary circumstances. It paused. My people were present when Jesus walked this earth. We watched him, knowing, understood what he was in ways your church never has. And now, at this moment, when humanity stands at precipice between transformation and extinction, it is time for truth to emerge. Time for you to know what church has hidden. Gabriel felt ice forming in his stomach. What do you mean? What has the church hidden? The being's eyes, if they were eyes, seemed too warm. Everything. The church has hidden everything about Jesus that mattered most. But I will show you, will give you truth directly. We'll let you see what we saw. We'll let you know what we know. And then you will decide whether to carry this truth forward or remain in comfortable ignorance before Gabriel could respond, before he could protest or agree or even process what was being offered. The being reached toward him. One long finger, or appendage that resembled finger, touched the center of his forehead. The church disappeared. Gabriel's body disappeared. He existed suddenly in space that was not space. In time that was not time. Pure consciousness without physical form. And before him, images began to unfold. Not hallucination. Not vision. Memory. The being was sharing its memory. Was allowing Gabriel to witness events that had occurred 2,000 years ago through eyes that were not human. Gabriel saw Galilee, saw dusty roads and small villages and people living simple lives under Roman occupation. And he saw Jesus, not Jesus from religious art, real Jesus, young man, late 20s maybe, brown skin, dark hair, calloused hands from carpentry, face that was handsome in ordinary way, nothing that would stand out in crowd. But his eyes were different, were deep, were ancient. We're looking at world with awareness that exceeded what normal human consciousness could contain. Gabriel watched Jesus teach, watched him speak to fishermen and tax collectors and prostitutes, watched him heal sick, drive out demons, perform miracles that Gabriel had heard about since childhood but was now witnessing as if he stood there himself, as if he was present in those moments. But he also saw what the Gospels had not recorded. Saw Jesus in moments when he thought he was alone, saw him struggling with his mission, saw him praying not to distant Father in heaven but to something else, someone else. And Gabriel saw who Jesus was praying to. He saw them, beings like the one that now shared this vision with him, tall, luminous, not of this earth. They appeared to Jesus in desert, in mountain, in Garden of Gethsemane. They spoke with him, guided him, gave him instructions about what he needed to do and say. And Jesus listened, obeyed, because he knew what they were, knew where they came from, knew that they were older and wiser than any human civilization. Gabriel wanted to deny what he was seeing, wanted to scream that this was lie, that Jesus spoke to God the Father, not to aliens, that what he was witnessing was deception designed to destroy his faith. But he could not deny, could not turn away, could only watch as truth he had never imagined unfolded before his consciousness. The being showed him Jesus' birth, and Gabriel saw that it was not virgin birth in miraculous sense. Church taught Mary had been chosen, selected by these beings for specific genetic traits. They had modified her, had implanted something in her womb, had created a pregnancy without human father but not without intervention. Jesus was hybrid, part human, part something else, designed specifically to serve as bridge between humanity and the cosmic civilizations that watched over a young species. Gabriel saw Jesus grow, saw him as child, already aware he was different, saw him learning to control abilities that normal humans did not possess, saw him struggling to understand his purpose, saw the beings appearing to him throughout his childhood and adolescence, teaching him, preparing him, explaining what role he would play. And Gabriel saw what Jesus was meant to accomplish. Not redemption from sin through blood sacrifice, not atonement for humanity's wickedness, not satisfying angry God who demanded death before he could forgive. Those were theological constructions added later by church that needed Jesus to fit into framework of Jewish temple sacrifice. Jesus' actual mission was simpler and more profound. He was sent to plant seeds of consciousness, to demonstrate through living example that humans could transcend their violent nature. That love was not weakness, but strength. That forgiveness was not capitulation, but power. That death was not ending, but transition. That divinity was not separate from humanity, but was humanity's true nature obscured by layers of fear and conditioning. The beings had determined that humanity 2,000 years ago stood at critical juncture, could evolve toward cooperation and compassion, or could evolve into tribalism and violence that would eventually destroy species. Jesus was intervention, was attempt to shift trajectory, was living demonstration of what humans could become if they chose to awaken to their potential. Gabriel saw Jesus' ministry through new eyes, saw that miracles were not violations of natural law, but applications of deeper laws that Jesus understood because of his hybrid nature. Healing was not supernatural, was manipulation of energy fields that surrounded and permeated physical bodies. Walking on water was not defying gravity, but existing partially in dimension where physical laws operated differently. Multiplication of bread and fish was not creating matter from nothing, but accessing abundance that existed in quantum field of potentiality. Jesus was not God pretending to be human, was human evolving toward godhood, was a demonstration that the gap between human and divine was not unbridgeable chasm, but spectrum of consciousness, that anyone could traverse with sufficient dedication and awakening. And Gabriel saw Jesus' teaching through new lens, saw that parables were not morales, but instructions for consciousness transformation. Kingdom of heaven being within you was not metaphor, was literal truth. Heaven was not location you went to after death, was state of expanded awareness you could access in life through recognizing your unity with all existence. Love your enemies was not impossible moral standard, was practical instruction. Because in state of awakened consciousness, you recognize that enemies were other faces of the same consciousness. You were harming them was harming yourself. Forgiving them was liberating yourself. Turn the other cheek was not encouraging victims, was demonstrating that violence met with non-violence short-circuit cycle of retaliation that destroys communities, was showing that strength could manifest as restraint rather than retaliation. Every teaching Jesus offered had deeper meaning than church had transmitted. Church had turned practical instructions for consciousness evolution into moral commandments that induced guilt, had turned demonstrations of human potential into evidence of human inadequacy, had turned teacher into idol, doorway into destination, example into exception. Gabriel saw crucifixion, and it was brutal, more brutal than artistic depictions captured. He felt Jesus' pain, felt nails piercing flesh, felt suffocation as lungs struggled against weight of body pulling down on arms, felt abandonment as disciples fled and crowd mocked, felt doubt as hours passed and rescue did not come and death approached. But Gabriel also felt something else. Felt Jesus choosing in every moment to respond with love rather than hatred. Felt him forgiving soldiers who drove nails. Felt him having compassion for religious leaders who had ordered his death. Felt him understanding that they were acting from fear, from ignorance, from programming they had received and never questioned. And Gabriel understood finally what crucifixion meant. Not payment for sin, not blood sacrifice, but demonstration. Jesus was showing that love could persist even through extreme violence, that consciousness could choose a response even when body was being destroyed, that forgiveness was possible even for those who tortured you, that the core of who you were could not be touched by physical suffering because core of who you were was not physical. The crucifixion was final lesson, was saying, this is how far love goes. This is what it looks like to embody divine consciousness in human flesh. This is what you're all capable of if you awaken to who you really are. Gabriel saw death, saw Jesus' last breath, saw his consciousness separate from body, but consciousness did not disappear, did not float up to heaven, did not enter waiting arms of Father. Instead, it transformed, expanded, rejoined the larger field of awareness from which it had temporarily Jesus, the individual, dissolved. Christ's consciousness remained, and Gabriel saw resurrection, but not as physical body reanimating, as consciousness choosing to manifest again in physical form for a brief period to prove to disciples that death was not ending. Jesus appeared to them not as corpse returned to life, but as consciousness condensed temporarily into visible form. Form that could be seen and touched, but that was not bound by normal physical limitations. Form that could appear and disappear at will, because it existed primarily in dimension that transcended material reality. The resurrection was proof, evidence that awareness survived bodily death. Demonstration that what humans called soul was real and indestructible. Promise that everyone would continue beyond physical death, would transition into expanded awareness, would eventually remember their unity with source consciousness. The vision continued. Gabriel saw what happened after Jesus' ascension, saw disciples spreading message, saw Paul perverting it, saw church forming and consolidating power, saw councils determining which gospels were canonical and which were heretical, saw truth being buried under layers of political compromise and theological construction. He saw why church had hidden the truth about Jesus, because truth was dangerous to institutional power. If people knew that Jesus was showing them their own potential rather than offering vicarious sacrifice, they would not need priests as intermediaries. If people understood that kingdom of heaven was within them, they would not submit to external authority. If people recognized that consciousness survived death and that love was all that mattered, they would not be controlled through fear of hell and promise of heaven. Church had turned empowering message into disempowering doctrine, had made humans dependent on institution for salvation, had kept them ignorant of their true nature, had obscured Jesus' actual teaching behind smoke of incense and barrier of Latin and mystery of not from conscious conspiracy, not from deliberate malice, but from simple human tendency to accumulate power and protect it, from impulse to make simple complex so that specialists were required, from need to feel special, to possess secret knowledge, to maintain hierarchy. The vision ended. Gabriel crashed back into his body, into the church, gasping for air. The being stood before him, patient and luminous, waiting for him to process what he had witnessed. Gabriel wept, not from grief exactly, from an overwhelming sense of loss of certainty, loss of the faith he had built his life upon, loss of Jesus as he had understood him for 41 years, but also from relief, from recognition that what he had seen made sense in a way church doctrine never quite had, from understanding that Jesus was more relevant and more powerful than church had taught, not less. Why me? Gabriel asked when he could speak. Why show this to me? The being's response was gentle. Because you are ready. Because you have been questioning. Because your dreams have been preparing you. Because you are a priest who actually tries to live Jesus' teaching rather than merely preaching it. Because transformation is coming, and humanity needs guides who understand truth rather than dogma, Gabriel struggled to his feet, stood before this impossible being that had just destroyed and rebuilt his entire understanding of reality. What am I supposed to do with this? If I tell anyone, I will be excommunicated, called heretic. Everything I have worked for will be destroyed. Yes, the being said, simply, you will lose everything if you speak truth. This is why truth is called costly. This is why prophets are murdered and teachers are silenced, because truth threatens those who benefit from lies. It paused. But silence is also choice, and that choice has consequences. Humanity is approaching point of no return, can evolve toward awakening or devolve into extinction, can embrace Jesus' actual teaching or continue following distorted version that church offers. You have been given truth. What you do with it will determine not just your fate, but fate of those you influence. Gabriel felt weight of this responsibility crushing him. He was one man, one insignificant priest in small parish in mountains of Peru. How could his choice possibly matter in cosmic scheme? The being seemed to read his thoughts. Every awakening begins with single individual. Every transformation starts with one person choosing truth over comfort. Jesus was one person. Buddha was one person. Muhammad was one person. All changed millions of lives by living authentically what they understood. You are being given same opportunity not to start religion, but to help correct one that has strayed from its source. Before Gabriel could respond, the being began to fade, not leaving, becoming translucent, preparing to return to wherever it had come from. Wait, Gabriel called. I need more. Need guidance. Need to understand what specifically I should do. The being paused. You need nothing external. Everything you need is within you. You have received truth. You have seen clearly. Now you must decide whether to live that truth regardless of cost or return to comfortable ignorance. That is only choice. That is always only choice. Then it was gone. Light faded. Church returned to normal. Darkness punctuated by flickering candles. Gabriel stood alone. Or perhaps not alone. Perhaps never alone. Because if what he had been shown was true, consciousness pervaded everything, connected everyone, made isolation impossible, even when it felt overwhelming. He collapsed in the pew, sat in silence as dawn approached, his mind spinning through implications. If Jesus was not divine in a unique way church taught, then entire structure of Christian theology collapsed. No Trinity, no substitutionary atonement, no exclusive path to salvation, just human showing other humans what was possible. Just teacher demonstrating truth. Just consciousness incarnate, proving that matter and spirit were not separate but existed on continuum. But if that was true, then Jesus' message became more powerful, not less. Became accessible rather than impossibly distant. Became invitation rather than obligation. Became hope rather than guilt. Gabriel remained in church through dawn, through morning light streaming through stained glass, through sounds of town waking, through his routine obligations becoming overdue. He could not move, could only sit with the ruins of his former certainty and try to imagine what could be built from rubble. Finally, late morning, he rose, walked to sacristy, removed his clerical collar, stared at it. This symbol of his office, of his authority, of his separation from laity, it felt suddenly like chain rather than honor. But he put it back on, not from cowardice, from strategic thinking. If he was going to carry truth forward, he needed platform, needed congregation who trusted him, needed position from which his voice would be heard. Leaving church immediately would accomplish nothing except isolating him. He would continue serving as priest, but would begin slowly, carefully to teach what he now understood. Would help people see Jesus not as distant deity but as elder brother showing the way. Would reveal gradually that divinity was not something to beg from external source but something to recognize within themselves. It would be dangerous, would be slow, might ultimately fail, but it was what the vision had called him to do. And Gabriel had not spent 15 years as priest to abandon calling just because calling had transformed into something more challenging than he had imagined. He celebrated Mass that morning, but the words felt different coming out of his mouth. When he spoke of Christ's sacrifice, he thought of Jesus demonstrating love's persistence through violence. When he consecrated bread and wine, he thought of consciousness condensing into matter. When he blessed congregation, he thought of awakening potential that existed within each person listening. After Mass, an elderly woman named Rosa approached him. She attended daily, had for decades. She looked at Gabriel with concern that suggested she perceived something had changed. "Father," she said quietly, "are you well? You seem different today. Troubled, perhaps." Gabriel smiled, felt tears threatening, but held them back. "I am well, Rosa, just had difficult night, wrestling with questions about faith and truth and what it means to serve God." Rosa nodded knowingly. The dark night of the soul, all great saints experience it. God is refining you, Father, making you into a better instrument for his work. Trust the process. Gabriel thanked her, watched her shuffle away, and thought about how she had interpreted his crisis through frameworks she possessed. She could not imagine that God might not be what church taught, that Jesus might be different than doctrine claimed. That truth might be stranger and more wonderful than tradition suggested. But perhaps someday she could imagine it. Perhaps someday he could help her see, help all of them see, not by destroying their faith, but by expanding it. Not by taking away Jesus, but by giving them Jesus as he actually was, rather than his church had remade him. The weeks that followed were difficult. Gabriel felt split between two realities, the one where he performed his priestly duties and maintained appearances and followed liturgy that felt increasingly hollow, and the one where he carried truth that burned inside him, that demanded expression, that made maintaining silence feel like betrayal. He began researching, spent hours reading materials he had previously dismissed, Gnostic Gospels excluded from canon, ancient texts suggesting Jesus traveled to India and Egypt, learning from mystery schools that predated Christianity, modern scholarship revealing how much of gospel narrative was theological construction rather than historical reporting. Everything confirmed what the being had shown him. Jesus as understood by church was fiction, not complete fiction, based on real person who said and did remarkable things, but heavily edited, interpreted through theological lenses that distorted original message, packaged for political purposes, weaponized for control. Gabriel also began connecting with others online who questioned Orthodox Christianity, found progressive Christians who emphasized Jesus' social justice teaching while minimizing supernatural claims, found mystics who spoke of direct experience of divine rather than secondhand reports, found scholars who documented how pagan influences shaped early Christianity, how Constantine weaponized faith for empire, how power corrupted message. But he found no one who had received truth the way he had. No one who had been visited by non-human intelligence and shown Jesus' actual origin and purpose. Either he was truly unique in his experience, or others existed but were staying silent, too afraid to expose themselves to ridicule and persecution. Gabriel decided to test waters, began preaching sermons that pushed boundaries of acceptable interpretation, emphasized Jesus' humanity over divinity, spoke of kingdom of heaven as present reality rather than future promise, suggested that salvation was waking up to who you already were rather than escaping punishment for who you were not. Initial response was positive. Several parishioners thanked him for sermons that made them think, that challenged them, that felt more relevant to their actual lives than traditional teaching about sin and redemption. But others were disturbed, complained the bishop that Father Gabriel was straying from sound doctrine, questioned whether he was still Orthodox Catholic. The bishop summoned Gabriel to Lima. They met in ornate office filled with religious art and theological texts. Bishop Romero was old, traditional, suspicious of anything that smacked of modernity or innovation. "Father Reyes," he began, "I have received concerning reports about your preaching. I have been told you are minimizing Christ's divinity, questioning traditional soteriology, suggesting that non-Christians might be saved. These are serious deviations from church teaching." Gabriel had prepared for this, had known it would come eventually. He responded carefully. "Your Excellency, I am not deviating from Christ's teaching. I am trying to help people understand what Christ actually taught versus what later theologians claimed he taught. I am trying to make gospel relevant to people living in 20th century rather than forcing them to accept first century cosmology." The bishop frowned. The gospel does not need to be made relevant. The gospel is eternal truth. Our job is not to adapt it to culture, but to cult culture, to conform to it. But which gospel? Gabriel pressed. Which version? The one Matthew recorded or the one John recorded? They differ significantly. The one Paul preached or the one James preached. They contradict on fundamental points. The one councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon constructed or the one that historical Jesus actually taught? Bishop Romero's face darkened. "You are treading on dangerous ground, Father. Questioning councils is questioning authority of church, and questioning authority of church is questioning guidance of Holy Spirit. This is path to heresy." Gabriel felt anger rising. Suppressed it. "I am not questioning guidance of Holy Spirit. I am questioning whether an institution has always correctly discerned that guidance." Councils were composed of fallible humans with political agendas. They made decisions based on power dynamics as much as spiritual insight. Are we really claiming that their conclusions are infallible for all time? Yes, the bishop said flatly. That is exactly what we claim. Church speaks with authority of Christ himself. To reject church teaching is to reject Christ. Gabriel saw that reasoning was futile. Bishop had constructed identity around certainty, could not question foundations without risking collapse of entire structure of meaning he had built upon them. Gabriel himself had been there just weeks ago, understood the terror of having certainty challenged. "Your Excellency," Gabriel said, adopting conciliatory tone, "I apologize if my preaching has caused concern. I will be more careful about how I express ideas. Will ensure that I remain within boundaries of acceptable interpretation." The bishop studied him, not fully satisfied but accepting capitulation. "See that you do. You are gifted priest, Gabriel. Do not waste that gift by pursuing innovative theology that serves only to confuse the faithful. Stick to basics. Sin, redemption, sacraments. This is what people need." Gabriel agreed, left the office, traveled back to his parish, and determined that he would not be silent, would not constrain truth to make comfortable those who benefited from its suppression, but would need to be more strategic, would need to work outside official channels, would need to reach people directly rather than through compromised institution. He started Bible study group, framed it as exploring historical Jesus, attracted people who were curious, who questioned, who felt traditional teaching did not satisfy their spiritual hunger. And in these intimate settings, with people who had already demonstrated openness, Gabriel began sharing what he had learned. He did not mention alien visitor, did not claim divine revelation, just presented historical scholarship, pointed out contradictions in Gospels, explained how theology evolved over centuries, suggested that Jesus' actual message might have been obscured by those who came after him. The group grew, word spread quietly. People drove from surrounding towns to attend. They discussed texts church had excluded from canon. Gospel of Thomas, with its emphasis on finding kingdom within. Gospel of Mary, with its elevation of feminine wisdom. Secret Book of John, with its radical reinterpretation of Genesis. They examined how much of Christianity was borrowed from earlier religions, virgin birth from pagan myths, resurrection from mystery cults, Trinity from Egyptian theology, communion from Mithraic ritual. not to dismiss Christianity, but to contextualize it, to see it as one expression among many of universal human longing to understand relationship between material and spiritual. And Gabriel watched people transform, watched them release guilt that had burdened them for years, watched them stop seeing themselves as miserable sinners awaiting judgment and start recognizing themselves as consciousness exploring physical existence, watched them become more compassionate, more patient, more willing to forgive themselves and others. This was what Jesus had intended. Not new religion, not exclusive path, not guilt-based control system, but awakening, liberation, recognition of true nature. And it was happening slowly in small group meeting weekly in church basement. But it was happening. Then Maria arrived. She appeared at study group 6 months after Gabriel's encounter with the being woman in her 30s. Obviously educated, obviously troubled. She sat quietly through entire discussion, saying nothing, just listening with intensity that suggested she was evaluating rather than merely learning. After group dispersed, she approached Gabriel. "Father," she said quietly, "I need to speak with you privately about something that I think you will understand, something that no one else would believe." Gabriel felt electricity run down his spine. He knew, somehow he knew, this was another person who had been visited, another carrier of truth. They went to his office. Maria sat across from him, hands trembling slightly. She looked at him with eyes that held same haunted quality Gabriel saw when he looked in mirror, the look of someone whose certainty had been shattered and who was still trying to assemble pieces into new coherent whole. "I was visited," she said without preamble, 3 months ago, by being that was not human. It appeared in my apartment, spoke without words, showed me things about reality that I cannot process, and it told me. It told me about Jesus." Gabriel leaned forward. "What did it tell you?" Maria's eyes filled with tears. "That he was not what church teaches. That he was created by them, by these beings, to help humanity. That his mission was to show us what we could become. That divinity is not separate from humanity. That we are all children of God, not because God created us from outside, but because God is experiencing existence through us." Gabriel felt tears on his own face. "I know I was shown the same thing. 6 months ago in this church, by being similar to what you described, Maria's relief was palpable. She was not alone, was not insane. Someone else had experienced the impossible and received the same message. They talked for hours, comparing experiences, discovering remarkable consistency. Different beings, maybe, different details of encounter, but same core revelation. Jesus was intervention by advanced consciousness, was hybrid designed to demonstrate human potential, was teacher showing path of awakening, was proof that humans could transcend their violent nature, was promise that consciousness survived death, was invitation to recognize divinity within rather than seeking it externally. And Jesus was coming back, not as single individual descending from sky, but as collective awakening, as millions of humans simultaneously remembering their true nature, as consciousness evolution reaching critical mass, as transformation of human civilization from competition-based to cooperation-based, a shift from fear to love as organizing principle. Maria became regular participant in study group. Then others appeared, slowly over months, never many at once, but steady trickle. People who had been visited, who had received downloads, who carried burden of truth they could not share openly without being dismissed as delusional. They found each other through through dreams that led them to specific places, through intuitions that said, "Go here, talk to this person," through network that existed beyond normal communication channels, operating on level of consciousness that skeptics denied it existed. Gabriel realized he was becoming hub, was being positioned as a leader not because he sought power, but because his role as priest gave him platform and credibility. People trusted him, sought his guidance, looked to him for interpretation of experiences they could not process alone. He felt inadequate for this role, felt that he was still processing his own encounter, his own crisis of faith, his own integration of truth that contradicted everything he had been taught. But he accepted responsibility anyway, because no one else would, because these people needed support, because the beings had chosen to reveal truth through multiple encounters rather than single dramatic event. And someone needed to weave individual experiences into coherent narrative. The group that formed was diverse: engineers and artists, doctors and farmers, young and old, educated and simple. What united them was encounter with impossible and willingness to integrate what they had learned rather than dismissing it to maintain comfortable ignorance. They met monthly, shared experiences, discussed implications, strategized about how to spread awareness without being dismissed or persecuted, and Gabriel taught them what he had learned about Jesus as he actually was, about consciousness as fundamental rather than emergent, about love as cosmic force rather than personal emotion, about death as transition rather than ending. But the question remained, what to do with this knowledge? How to spread it without starting cult or provoking backlash that would destroy them before message could take root. One person suggested they publish testimony, write book detailing encounters and revelation. Gabriel vetoed immediately. Book would be dismissed as fiction or collective delusion, would be ridiculed by skeptics and condemned by religious authorities, would not change minds, would only expose us to attack. Another suggested creating website, online forum where others with similar experiences could find them. Gabriel was more receptive but cautious. Internet provides anonymity and reach, but also attracts attention from those who would suppress us and makes us vulnerable to infiltration by those seeking to discredit movement before it gains traction. Maria proposed a different approach. We do not try to convince anyone. We just live the truth, embody love, help people, demonstrate through our actions what awakened consciousness looks like, and trust that example will speak louder than words ever could. Gabriel recognized wisdom in this. Jesus had not written books or built institutions or created media campaigns. He had just lived authentically, had loved unconditionally, had served selflessly. And his example had transformed billions despite every attempt to suppress or distort his message. We become living gospels, Gabriel said slowly. We let our lives testify to truth. We help everyone we can without requiring they believe what we believe. We create communities based on cooperation and compassion. And we trust that as consciousness evolves, people will recognize what we are doing and want to understand source of transformation they witness. The group agreed this would be strategy, not propaganda, not proselytizing, just authentic living, being light, allowing truth to manifest through their choices and relationships, planting seeds that would grow when conditions were right. They dispersed back to their lives, but stayed connected, met monthly, supported each other, and began implementing the strategy in their own context. Gabriel continued as priest, but his priesthood was transformed. He cared less about liturgy and more about people, less about correct doctrine and more about healing relationships, less about maintaining traditions and more about serving practical needs of struggling community. He started social programs, feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, teaching literacy, providing health care, not as evangelism, not as recruitment, just as service, as expression of love that recognized divine in every person regardless of their beliefs or behaviors. And people noticed, parish grew, not because Gabriel preached compelling sermons, because people experienced being genuinely cared for without strings attached, because Gabriel saw them, really saw them, recognized their consciousness, honored their dignity, treated them as manifestations of divine rather than as sinners needing salvation. The bishop noticed too, called Gabriel to Lima again. This time the conversation was different. Father Reyes, Bishop Romero, said, "Your parish has tripled in size over past year. You have started programs that are serving hundreds. You have reputation as priests who actually helps people rather than just talking about helping them. This is commendable." Gabriel waited for the other shoe to drop. However, the bishop continued, "I continued to hear troubling reports about your theology. People say you suggest all religions contain truth, that you imply church does not have monopoly on salvation, that you question traditional teachings about hell and atonement. These are serious concerns." Gabriel chose his words carefully. "Your Excellency, I teach what Jesus taught. Love God, love neighbor, forgive enemies, serve poor, seek kingdom within. These are not controversial, these are core gospel, but you interpret them in ways that undermine church authority." The bishop pressed. "You suggest people can find God without church, that they do not need sacraments or priests or tradition, that personal experience matters more than revealed doctrine. I suggest," Gabriel said evenly, "that church exists to serve people, not the reverse. That institution is means, not end. That if church is not helping people encounter divine, then church is failing its mission regardless of how perfectly it maintains traditions." The bishop's face reddened. "You are arrogant, Father Reyes. You set your personal interpretation above 2,000 years of apostolic teaching. You elevate your experience above collective wisdom of church. This is precisely the individualism that Protestantism unleashed, and that has shattered Christian unity. Gabriel felt something shift inside him. He was done being diplomatic, done constraining truth to protect the institution, done serving organization that valued its own preservation above service to humanity. With respect, Your Excellency, institutions preserving itself at expense of truth, demanding conformity rather than encouraging seeking, using fear of hell and promise of heaven to control rather than inspire. Jesus challenged religious authorities of his day for exactly these reasons, and they killed him for it. Church today has become what Pharisees were then, guardians of tradition rather than servants of truth. The bishop stood, "You are relieved of your duties, Father Reyes, effective immediately. You will not celebrate Mass, will not hear confessions, will not perform any priestly functions. You are suspended pending investigation of heresy. If you do not recant your positions, you will be defrocked." Gabriel stood as well, felt strange combination of terror and relief. "I will not recant truth, will not pretend I did not see what I saw, did not learn what I learned. You can take my collar. You cannot take my calling." He left bishop's office, drove back to mountains, to parish he had served for 7 years, and felt that he was driving toward freedom rather than away from it. The church had just released him from obligation to serve institution, had freed him to serve truth directly. News of Gabriel's suspension spread quickly through the parish. By the time he arrived back, people were already gathering at the church, not to protest, not to demand explanation, simply to be present, to show solidarity with priests who had served them faithfully for 7 years. Gabriel stood before them in the church he could no longer officially serve, looked at faces he had come to know and love, saw confusion, saw concern, saw also determination in eyes of those who had been part of study group, who understood what was happening, why Gabriel had been silenced. "The bishop has suspended me," Gabriel said simply, "because I have been teaching things that challenge traditional doctrine, because I have suggested that Jesus' message might be different from what institution claims, because I have prioritized truth over comfortable tradition." An elderly man named Diego Stud had attended church for 80 years, had known for priests before Gabriel. "Father," he said, voice steady despite his age, "what you have taught us has made me understand Jesus for first time in my life. For 80 years I heard about sin and hell and needing to be saved. You taught me that I am already whole, already divine, already loved beyond measure. That teaching has transformed me. I do not care what bishop says. You are my priest." Others murmured agreement. Maria stood next. "Gabriel has helped me heal from trauma I carried for decades. Not through religious platitudes, through showing me that consciousness survives, that nothing is truly lost, that love is stronger than death. This teaching is not heresy, is truth that church should have been offering all along." One by one, people stood, testified to transformation they had experienced, not because Gabriel performed miracles or made grand promises, because he had loved them genuinely, had seen their divine nature, had treated them as consciousness rather than as sinners. Finally, Gabriel raised his hand for silence. "I appreciate your support more than words can express. But I must be honest with you. I am no longer officially your priest, cannot celebrate Mass or administer sacraments. Church will send replacement. You will need to decide whether to accept new priest or to follow different path." "We follow you," someone called from back. Others echoed agreement. "Wherever you go, we go." Gabriel felt tears threatening. "I am not starting new church, am not creating sin. Just want to teach truths as I understand it, to help people awaken to who they really are. If you choose to join me in that, I welcome you. But do not follow me because I am special or have authority. Follow truth itself, wherever it leads." Over following weeks, community organized itself. They could not use church building. Bishop made that clear. So they met in homes, in community center, in fields when weather permitted. And they continued studying, learning, practicing consciousness, transformation that Jesus had demonstrated. Gabriel no longer wore a clerical collar, felt liberated without it, felt more authentic, more aligned with what he now understood priesthood to be. Not elevation above laity, not special status, just willingness to serve, to teach, to hold space for others' awakening. The suspension became blessing in disguise. Freed from institutional constraints, Gabriel could teach openly what he had been carefully hinting at, could share more fully what the being had revealed, could acknowledge that Jesus was not what church taught, but was something more wonderful and more accessible. Not everyone stayed. Some returned to official church, uncomfortable with direction Gabriel was taking. Some left because teachings threatened their certainty, and certainty felt safer than mystery. But core group remained and grew. As word spread that there was priest teaching something new, something that actually transformed lives, seekers began arriving from across region. Gabriel taught that Jesus was demonstration, not exception. That every human carried same divine potential Jesus had manifested. That awakening was not about believing correct doctrines, but about practicing consciousness expansion, about choosing love over fear, about recognizing unity beneath apparent separation, about serving others because others were other faces of same consciousness. He taught that death was transition, not ending. That consciousness could not be destroyed because consciousness was fundamental fabric of reality, not emergent property of brain. That everyone would continue beyond physical death, would return to oceanic awareness from which they had temporarily would eventually choose to incarnate again when new lessons called them back to physical existence. He taught that heaven and hell were not locations but states of consciousness, that heaven was recognizing your unity with divine source, that hell was believing yourself separate, isolated, unlovable, that both could be experienced in life, did not have to wait for death. That salvation was waking up from nightmare of separation, not being rescued from punishment. And he taught that Jesus was returning, not as single figure in clouds, but as collective awakening. That consciousness evolution was accelerating, that humanity stood at threshold of transformation that would either save species or mark its failure to mature beyond violence and division. That everyone present had a role to play, that their choices mattered more than they imagined. The teachings resonated because they were true. Not true in sense of matching orthodox doctrine. True in sense of matching lived experience. People recognized truth when they heard it, felt it in their bones, knew it in places that preceded conditioning, and the community thrived. They created support systems, helped each other with practical needs, cared for each other's children, visited the sick, fed the hungry, not as religious obligation, as natural expression of recognizing divine in everyone. They also began having shared mystical experiences. During group meditations, presence would manifest, sometimes subtle, sometimes overwhelming. The beings were still watching, still guiding, still supporting awakening that was spreading faster than authorities could suppress. Gabriel had another encounter 6 months after his suspension. He was alone in mountains, hiking trail he had walked many times, stopped at clearing that offered view of valleys below. And the being appeared. Same one, different one. He could not tell. They were similar, but not identical, like members of species rather than singular entity. The being communicated approval, so Gabriel was fulfilling role he had been prepared for. Said his willingness to sacrifice position and security for truth was exactly what was needed. Said others across the world were doing similar work, were teaching similar truths, were preparing humanity for transformation approaching faster than most realized. Gabriel asked when. When would transformation reach critical mass? When would awakening become obvious rather than hidden phenomenon? The being showed him timeline, not fixed, not predetermined, but probable. Within 5 years, enough humans would awaken that tipping point would be reached. After that, change would cascade. Systems built on fear and control would collapse. New structures based on cooperation and love would emerge. Not overnight, not without struggle, but inevitably once threshold was crossed and the being showed him his role in that transformation. Not as leader of movement, not as new messiah, just as one of thousands of teachers preparing ground, planting seeds, helping people remember who they were so they could participate consciously in evolution rather than being dragged through it unconsciously. What about church? Gabriel asked. What happens to Christianity when truth emerges about Jesus? The being's response was compassionate. Institution will fracture. Some will cling to tradition and condemn new understanding as heresy. Some will adapt, will integrate new information into expanded theology. Some will dissolve, no longer necessary once people access divine directly. This is natural, This is healthy. Institutions should serve consciousness, not imprison it. When they no longer serve, they should be allowed to die. But millions find comfort in church, Gabriel protested. Find community and meaning. What happens to them when structure collapses? They will grieve, they being acknowledged, will resist, will feel lost temporarily. But humans are resilient. We'll create new structures, better structures, ones that honor both tradition and truth, ones that recognize Jesus as teacher rather than idol, ones that empower rather than control. You are helping build those structures now. Others will follow your example. Gabriel returned from mountains with renewed sense of purpose. He was not destroying Christianity, was helping it evolve into what it should have been from beginning, was recovering Jesus' actual teaching from beneath layers of theological distortion. He wrote, not book, but essays, posted them online under pseudonym, shared what he had learned without claiming special authority, just offered perspective for consideration, let readers decide whether it resonated or not. The essays spread, were shared across forums and social media, were translated into multiple languages, were discussed and debated and integrated by people around the world who were hungry for teaching that made sense of their experiences and intuitions. Gabriel also began training others, people in his community who wanted to teach, who felt called to help others awaken. He taught them not to proselytize, not to insist they had exclusive truth, just to share their experience, to live authentically, to embody love, to trust that example would attract those who were ready. Maria became one of his most effective students. She had a gift for explaining complex spiritual concepts in accessible language, for translating mystical experience into practical guidance. She started her own group in city 2 hours away, then trained others who started groups elsewhere. Organic network forming without central control or hierarchy. This was how Jesus had worked. Gabriel realized no organization, no institution, just teaching person to person, trusting that truth would spread through human connection rather than through authoritarian decree. Church had tried to bottle Jesus, to contain him, to control his message. But Jesus was too large for any container, was consciousness itself, flowing around every obstacle, finding every crack, ultimately unstoppable. News of Gabriel's work reached church authorities. They were not pleased, issued formal declaration of heresy, excommunicated him, warned faithful not to attend his gatherings or read his writings, said his teachings were demonic deception designed to lead souls to damnation. Some people in Gabriel's community were shaken by this, worried that they were indeed being deceived, worried that they would go to hell for following heresy. Gabriel addressed these concerns directly. Church says, I am heretic, he acknowledged. They say, I am leading you away from salvation. Let us examine that claim. Are you becoming more loving or more hateful? More compassionate or more cruel? Peaceful or more violent, more generous or more selfish? If my teaching is producing love, peace, compassion, and generosity, how can it be demonic? Jesus himself said you would know true prophets by their fruits. Look at fruits of what we are doing here. Are they good or evil? People looked at their own transformations, looked at relationships they had healed, looked at services they were providing to community, looked at joy they were experiencing, and determined that fruits were good. Now, whatever church said, they were becoming better humans through teachings Gabriel offered. The excommunication freed Gabriel completely. He had no more ties to institution, no more obligation to maintain appearances. He could teach openly, fully, without fear of further punishment. Worst they could do had been done, and he had survived, had thrived actually, was more effective now than he had been as official priest. Years passed, Gabriel aged his hair grade. His face lined with years of outdoor living and intense teaching, but his eyes remained bright. His energy remained strong. He was living in alignment with truth, and that alignment sustained him in ways that normal life never had. The community he had started, now numbered in hundreds, had spread to multiple locations, had spawned other communities started by people he had trained. The network was growing exponentially, still underground mostly, still dismissed by mainstream as fringe movement, but undeniably expanding. And they were not alone. Reports came from around the world of similar movements. Teachers who had been visited by non-human intelligence, who had received revelations about Jesus and consciousness and humanity's potential, who were gathering people and teaching and preparing ground for transformation. Gabriel connected with these teachers. They formed loose confederation, shared resources, supported each other, compared notes on what they were learning, and discovered remarkable consistency across all their teachings despite no formal coordination. This was not human conspiracy, was genuine intervention by intelligence beyond humanity, was systematic preparation for consciousness shift. Then it happened, the thing they had been preparing for, the acceleration the beings had promised. It started with children. Reports began surfacing of young children, aged 3 to 7 mostly, speaking about previous lives, describing deaths they had experienced, naming people and places they should not know. Researchers investigated, verified details, confirmed that these children had accurate memories of people who had died before the children were born. This happened sometimes, had been documented, but now it was epidemic. Thousands of children globally remembering previous incarnations, providing evidence that consciousness persisted through death, that reincarnation was real, that church teaching about single life followed by eternal judgment was incomplete at best, misleading at worst. Religious authorities tried to suppress the reports, claimed children were being coached, argued that Satan was planting false memories, but evidence was too overwhelming, too consistent, too verifiable. Consciousness clearly survived death. This was provable now, not just faith claim. Then adults started having spontaneous memories of previous lives. Not under hypnosis, not during meditation, just randomly during normal activities, suddenly remembering dying in World War II, or living in ancient Egypt, or existing in civilizations that predated recorded history. The memories were detailed, accurate, verifiable, and they shattered materialist assumption that consciousness was produced by brain and ended at death. Science scrambled to explain phenomena, proposed theories about genetic memory, about quantum information storage, about collective unconscious, but none of the theories fit the data as well as simple explanation that consciousness was primary, that it incarnated repeatedly, that physical death was transition rather than termination. Gabriel watched this unfold with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This was what the beings had promised, evidence that would make teachings undeniable, but it was also that people's certainties were crumbling. Religious systems based on afterlife doctrine were threatened. Materialist systems based on death as ending were undermined. Chaos was spreading as old paradigms collapsed without clear new paradigm emerging to replace them. This was when teachers like Gabriel became crucial, when communities they had built became refuges, when teachings they had been offering quietly for years became vital for helping people integrate revolutionary understanding of consciousness and existence. Gabriel found himself busier than ever, traveling to speak at gatherings, counseling people whose memories of previous lives were surfacing unexpectedly, training teachers to handle influx of seekers who were awakening faster than they could process. He was 60 years old now. Should have been slowing down. Instead, he was accelerating, barely sleeping, sustained by a sense that this was the moment he had been prepared for. Then Jesus appeared, not to Gabriel alone, 2,000 simultaneously. In dreams, in meditations, in spontaneous visions, always the same message, always the same presence. The consciousness that had incarnated 2,000 years ago as Jesus of Nazareth was manifesting again. Not in single body, but through collective human consciousness that was finally ready to receive what he had been trying to teach all along. Jesus spoke about love, not sentimental love, not romantic love, cosmic love, the force that held atoms together. That organized chaos into complexity that drove evolution toward greater consciousness. Love was not feeling but fundamental structure of reality. Aligning with it brought peace. Resisting it brought suffering. Jesus spoke about forgiveness, not as moral virtue, but as practical necessity. Holding resentment was poison, was violence against yourself. Forgiving others liberated you from past, allowed you to be present, allowed you to participate in creation of new reality rather than being chained to old reality. Jesus spoke about unity, not as abstract concept, but as literal truth. All consciousness was interconnected. Separation was illusion. Harming another was harming yourself. Helping another was helping yourself. This was not metaphor. Was description of how reality actually operated once you saw beyond surface appearances. And Jesus spoke about his return, said this was it. This awakening was the promised return. Not second coming as single event, but as recognition spreading through collective human consciousness. Every person who awakened to their divine nature was Jesus returning. Every act of genuine love was a resurrection of Christ's principle. Every moment of forgiveness was redemption, not from sin, but from illusion of separation. The visions terrified religious authorities. They declared it was mass delusion, satanic deception, psychological contagion, anything except what it appeared to be. Consciousness evolution catalyzed by non-human intelligence that had been guiding humanity since its inception. But authorities could not stop what was happening, could not suppress truth that was emerging from within millions of humans simultaneously. The awakening had reached critical mass, was cascading through human consciousness faster than any institution could contain. Churches split, some embraced new understanding, revised theologies to accommodate reincarnation and consciousness survival in Jesus as teacher rather than sole divine being. Others hardened, doubled down on traditional doctrine, condemned new teachings as apostasy. Criticism that made Protestant Reformation look gentle by comparison. Gabriel found himself mediating conflicts, helping people who wanted to maintain connection to Christian tradition while integrating new understanding, showing them that Jesus of expanded consciousness was more, not less, than Jesus of traditional doctrine. That evolution of understanding did not require abandoning roots, just expanding beyond them. He worked particularly with clergy who were awakening, priests and pastors who were having visions, receiving revelations, finding themselves unable to preach traditional doctrine with integrity. Many had lost positions like Gabriel. Many were struggling with loss of identity and purpose. Gabriel helped them see that priesthood was not about institution, was about service, about teaching, about helping others awaken, and that work was more important now than ever. A new form of Christianity emerged. Not denomination, not organization, just network of awakened Christians who honored Jesus as elder brother, as way shower, as demonstration of human potential rather than as impossible exception. They met in homes and parks and any space available. They celebrated Eucharist not as literal transubstantiation, but as remembrance that matter and spirit were continuous, that divine permeated physical, that every meal could be communion when approached consciously. They practiced healing, not through intercessory prayer to distant God, but through recognizing that consciousness could influence matter, that focused intention could alter outcomes, that what Jesus and other mystics had demonstrated was accessible to anyone who understood principles and practiced them. They served communities practically, fed hungry, housed homeless, taught literacy, provided healthcare, not to recruit converts, but because service to others was service to self once you recognized unity. Because alleviating suffering anywhere alleviated suffering everywhere, and they grew. Not through evangelism, but through example. People saw transformation in awakened Christians and wanted what they had. Wanted peace, they demonstrated. Wanted joy, they radiated. Wanted sense of purpose, they embodied. And when Sikhs asked what made the difference, awakened ones shared their understanding. Not as doctrine to be believed, but as invitation to experience directly. 5 years after Gabriel's excommunication, gathering was organized, International Congress of Awakened Humans. Thousands converged on Peru, on mountains where Gabriel had been teaching. They came from every continent, every religious background, every cultural context, but all shared core recognition. That consciousness was fundamental. That love was cosmic principle. That separation was illusion. That humanity stood at threshold of transformation. Gabriel was asked to speak not as leader, not as authority, just as elder who had been on path longer than most, who had sacrificed more, who had been among first to receive revelation and act on it despite cost. He stood before thousands, felt their collective consciousness, felt the presence of beings who were watching, who had invested so much effort into preparing humanity for this moment. And he spoke from his heart. We are living through most important transition in human history, he began. Not because of technology, not because of politics, because of consciousness. Because enough humans have awakened that tipping point has been reached. Because what was hidden is being revealed. Because truth the church tried to suppress and science tried to ignore is breaking through all barriers. He paused, looked at faces watching him, saw diversities, saw unity beneath diversities. Jesus was not what church taught, was human who awakened fully to divine nature, was bridged between physical and spiritual, was demonstration that we all are consciousness expressing through temporary physical form, that we all survive death, that we all are connected at deepest level, that we all are, in truest sense, Children of God, not because we were created by external deity, but because we are expressions of divine creativity experiencing existence through infinite perspectives. Heads nodded. People wept. These were truths they knew but had been afraid to voice. Hearing them spoken openly, confidently, by a priest who had lost everything for truth, validated their own intuitions. Church condemned me for teaching this, Gabriel continued, called me heretic, excommunicated me, and they were right to do so, according to their doctrine. Because this teaching destroys foundation of institutional authority. If people can access divine directly, they do not need priests as intermediaries. If salvation is waking up rather than being rescued, they do not need institution to save them. If Jesus was showing us our potential rather than offering substitutionary atonement, then 2,000 years of theology collapse. He smiled, and this is a good thing, not destruction for destruction's sake, but clearing ground for something better to grow. Christianity needs to die in current form so it can resurrect in truer form. Form that honors Jesus' actual teaching rather than doctrines built on his name. Form that empowers rather than controls. Form that serves consciousness evolution rather than maintaining institutional power. The gathering continued for a week. People shared experiences, taught practices, made connections, formed alliances. And most importantly, they established a network that would continue beyond the gathering. Network of awakened humans supporting each other, teaching others, preparing ground for transformation that was no longer theoretical future but present reality. Gabriel returned home exhausted but fulfilled. He had done what he was meant to do, had helped enough people awaken that movement was self-sustaining now, had planted enough seeds that harvest was assured. His role as pioneer was complete. Now he could rest, could let younger teachers carry torch forward. He was 65. His body was wearing out. Years of travel and teaching and stress of being publicly condemned had taken toll. He developed illness, cancer, aggressive. Doctors gave him 6 months. Gabriel was not afraid, had been shown that death was transition. That consciousness continued, that he would simply return to source, would rest, would eventually choose whether to incarnate again. Death held no terror for someone who understood its true nature, but he was sad. Sad to leave work incomplete. Sad to abandon students who still needed guidance. Sad to not see final fruition of transformation he had helped begin. Maria visited him often during his illness. She had become a powerful teacher in her own right, led community of hundreds, trained dozens of other teachers. She sat beside his bed one afternoon, holding his hand, both of them crying, but not from despair. I am afraid, she admitted, afraid to continue without you. You have been anchor. Without you, I worry we will fragment, will lose our way. Gabriel squeezed her hand weakly. You were never meant to follow me. We're meant to follow truth. And truth does not need me to advocate for it. Truth simply will continue revealing itself through millions of humans. Through you, through everyone who is awakened. I am not special. Not necessary. Just happen to be first in our region to receive revelation and act on it. But church is fighting back, Maria said. New Pope has issued encyclical condemning consciousness teachings, declaring that anyone who rejects traditional doctrine about Jesus' unique divinity is he is trying to stop awakening by reasserting authority. Gabriel smiled, coughed, caught his breath. He cannot stop what has begun. Can only make church irrelevant faster. People have experienced truth directly, have seen through veil, have remembered who they are. No decree from Rome can make them forget. Institution is dying. Let it die with dignity. Help those trapped within it to escape before collapse becomes total. Maria stayed until he slept, returned the next day, and the next was with him when he died 3 months after diagnosis. She held his hand, felt his breath grow shallow, felt his consciousness begin withdrawing from body, and she saw his awareness leaving physical form, saw it expanding, transforming, rejoining larger field of consciousness from which it had temporarily ended. Gabriel was not gone, was changed, was freed from limitation of body, and somehow, impossibly, Maria heard his voice, not with ears, with direct consciousness communication that bypassed normal sensory channels. He said he was fine, said transition was gentle, said he could see now with clarity that was impossible while trapped in physical perspective, said work would continue, said she should not grieve but celebrate, said he would guide from other side when guidance was needed and permitted. Maria wept, but tears were not sorrow or gratitude were a recognition that Gabriel had demonstrated one final teaching, had shown that death was not ending, that consciousness truly did persist, that everything he had taught was validated by his peaceful transition and continued presence. Gabriel's death became rallying point. Thousands who had been influenced by his teaching mourned publicly, celebrated his life, testified the transformation they had experienced through his guidance and his martyrdom, because that was what it was, even though church had not killed him directly. Inspired others to speak more boldly, to teach more openly, to risk condemnation for truth. More clergy left institutional church. More communities formed based on expanded understanding of Jesus and consciousness. More people awakened to their divine nature. The cascade effect the beings had predicted was manifesting. Exponential growth, doubling and until awakened humans numbered in millions and would soon number in billions. Traditional church leadership fought desperately to maintain authority, issued condemnations, threatened hell, promised damnation. But threats rang hollow to people who knew death was transition and hell was state of consciousness, not eternal location. Institution had lost its primary tools of control, fear of death, and fear of divine judgment. Some churches adapted, integrated new understanding, evolved theologies to accommodate reincarnation and consciousness, survival, and Jesus as exemplar rather than unique exception. These churches thrived, became centers of genuine spiritual exploration rather than enforced conformity. Others refused to adapt, insisted on traditional doctrine despite mounting evidence it was incomplete. These churches declined, lost members, lost relevance, would eventually close their doors, leaving buildings as monuments to worldview that humanity had outgrown. 10 years after Gabriel's death, Maria stood where he had stood, addressing international gathering, even larger than first one. Tens of thousands present physically, millions watching online. She was recognized as one of premier teachers of consciousness Christianity, had written books, had traveled the world, had trained hundreds of teachers who had trained thousands more. She spoke about Gabriel, about his courage, about his willingness to sacrifice everything for truth, about legacy he had left. He showed us that Jesus was not impossible exception, but achievable example. That awakening was not reserved for special few, but was available to everyone willing to do the work. That institutional Christianity had buried truth church was supposed to protect, and he paid price for speaking that truth. Lost position, lost status. Lost life ultimately to illness, probably triggered by stress of being condemned by institution he had served faithfully. She paused, let silence settle. But he also showed us that speaking truth despite cost is the only way transformation happens. That martyrdom, whether literal or metaphorical, is often required to crack shell of comfortable ignorance. That seeds must die to produce harvest. And harvest Gabriel planted through sacrifice has exceeded anything he could have imagined. She looked across crowd, saw diversity, saw unity, saw awakened humans from every background gathered in recognition of fundamental truth. We are living in age of revelation. Age when what was hidden is being exposed. Age when consciousness is evolving rapidly enough to be perceptible within single generation. Age that Jesus promised when he said kingdom of heaven was at hand. It was always at hand. Just required enough humans to awaken to make it manifest in physical reality. The gathering was not just Christian. Awakened Muslims were present. Awakened Buddhists. Awakened Hindus. Awakened atheists who had discovered consciousness without religious framework, all recognized same fundamental truth expressed through different cultural languages. All work towards same goal of helping humanity transcend division and violence. They established declaration, not creed, not doctrine, just articulation of core principles that seem to be true based on cumulative experience of millions who had awakened. Consciousness is primary. Love is cosmic principle. Separation is illusion. Death is transition. Service is joy. All beings are manifestations of divine. All paths that lead to love and compassion are valid. The declaration spread, was adopted by awakened communities globally, became rallying point, became foundation for new civilization that was emerging from ruins of old paradigm. Not utopia, not perfection, just significant improvement. Just humans finally learning to cooperate rather than compete. Finally recognizing that thriving of all was prerequisite for thriving of each. 20 years after Gabriel's death, his name was known worldwide, was taught in schools alongside other consciousness pioneers, was honored as bridge figure between old Christianity and new. was recognized as martyr who sacrificed comfort and security so truth could spread. Church that had condemned him issued apology. New leadership, recognizing that institutional Christianity needed to evolve or die completely, acknowledged that Gabriel had been teaching truth, had been ahead of his time, had seen what church would eventually need to see to remain relevant. But Gabriel's community had no interest in being reabsorbed by institution. They had tasted freedom of direct spiritual experience, had learned to access divine without intermediaries, had built communities based on love and service rather than dogma and control. They continued as independent network, one of many contributing to emerging global consciousness that transcended traditional religious boundaries. 30 years after Gabriel's death, Maria was old. 70 now, still teaching, but less frequently, training successors. Preparing to pass torch he had carried for decades, she returned to mountains where Gabriel had taught, to a church where he had served before suspension. Building was no longer Catholic, had been purchased by awakened community, was now called Church of Awakening Consciousness, was packed every week with seekers learning truths that Gabriel had been among first to teach openly. Maria stood in the same spot where Gabriel had stood when being appeared to him. She closed her eyes, reached out with her consciousness, and felt Gabriel's presence. Still guiding, still supporting, still serving from beyond physical limitation, and she felt to others, the beings, the watchers, the ones who had invested millennia in humanity's evolution, and who were celebrating now because transformation had succeeded, because humanity had crossed threshold, because awakening had reached critical mass. Humanity would survive. Evolve. Would eventually join community of conscious civilizations that populated galaxy and dimensions beyond, would contribute unique perspective earned through difficult journey from violence to peace, would become elders themselves, helping other young species navigate same transition. And Jesus' mission was complete. Not the mission church had claimed, but actual mission to plant seeds of consciousness evolution that would germinate across centuries and finally bear fruit when conditions were right. Jesus had succeeded. His teaching, despite being buried under doctrine, had survived, had been lived, had transformed species. He had been sent to help. Maria smiled, opened her eyes, looked at young people studying in church. They were future, were a generation born into age of awakening, would never know prison of unconsciousness that previous generations had endured, would build civilization on foundation of love rather than fear, would create systems based on cooperation rather than competition, would demonstrate that humans could be stewards of planet rather than destroyers. She felt peace, felt completion, knew her own transition approached, welcomed it, was curious about what existed beyond physical death, was ready to see truth even more clearly than awakening had allowed, was grateful for life she had lived, for work she had done, for roles she had played in humanity's transformation. That evening, Maria sat on Mountain Ridge, watching sunset. Same ridge where Gabriel had watched sunset, where he had encountered being that had revealed truth about Jesus. She felt presence gathering, not single being, multiple, and something more. Consciousness that was larger than individual beings. Source itself, perhaps. Divine awareness that permeated existence and experienced itself through infinite forms. And she heard, or felt, or simply knew the message that was meant not just for her, but for all humanity. You have done well. You have awakened. You have remembered. You have chosen love. You have demonstrated that consciousness can evolve, that species can transform, that what seems impossible becomes inevitable once enough. Individuals commit to truth. Jesus was proud of you. Gabriel is proud of you. All who work to prepare you for this moment are celebrating, but work is not finished. Never finished. Consciousness always evolves, always expands, always seeks new experiences, new perspectives, new ways of knowing itself. Continue growing, continue serving, continue loving, and know that you are never alone. We are always with you, as you are always with us, because separation is illusion. There is only one experiencing existence through infinite forms, and that one is you. Maria wept from joy, from recognition, from finally understanding what Jesus had meant when he said, I and the Father are one. Not claiming unique divinity, declaring universal divinity, revealing truth that all consciousness was ultimately singular, That division into apparently separate beings was temporary illusion designed to allow infinite creativity and experience. She stood, walked down mountain as stars emerged, returned to community that Gabriel had started and she had nurtured, returned to students who would carry teaching forward after she was gone, returned to work that was never finished because consciousness evolution was an eternal project. And she knew that when her time came, when her body failed and her consciousness withdrew, she would transition peacefully as Gabriel had, would continue guiding from other side as Gabriel continued guiding, would perhaps incarnate again when new lessons called her back to physical existence, would eventually merge completely with source consciousness and then individuate again for another adventure in another form and another dimension. This was the one truth about Jesus that church had never spoken of, not because they knew and hid it, but because they had never understood. Jesus was not exception, proving humans were inferior. Was example, proving humans were divine. Was not God become man to save humanity from itself. Was human become conscious of divinity, showing humanity how to save itself. Church had taught helplessness. Jesus taught empowerment. Church had taught unworthiness. Jesus taught inherent divinity. Church had taught dependence on external authority. Jesus taught direct access to source. Church had taught fear of death. Jesus taught death as transition. Church had taught separation between human and divine. Jesus taught unity, and that truth, once finally understood and embodied by enough humans, changed everything. Changed individuals who remembered their true nature. Changed communities built on love rather than fear. Changed civilizations structured around cooperation rather than competition. Changed species evolved from violence toward peace. Gabriel had been one small part of that transformation. Maria had been another. Millions more had contributed, and billions more would contribute as awakening spread through remaining unconscious populations. But no one was special. All were essential. Each person who chose love over fear, who recognized unity beneath separation, who served others as service to self, was Jesus returning, was Christ consciousness manifesting, was divine incarnating in physical form. This was second coming. Not event, but process. Not single savior, but collective salvation. Not Jesus arriving from outside to fix broken world, but Jesus emerging from within to transform world through awakened humanity living his actual teaching. The church that had condemned Gabriel could not see this, could not accept that they had been wrong for 2,000 years, could not admit that the institution built on distorted gospel needed to die so true gospel could flourish. But that was fine. That was natural. Old paradigms always resisted new ones, always fought to maintain themselves, always failed eventually because truth was more powerful than any attempt to suppress it. Gabriel had known this, had accepted cost of speaking truth anyway, had trusted that seeds he planted would bear fruit even if he did not live to see harvest. And he had been right. Harvest had come, was still coming, would continue coming until all humanity awakened or until humanity destroyed itself trying to prevent awakening. But odds favored awakening now. Critical mass had been achieved. Transformation was inevitable. Maria lived 5 more years, taught until final week, died peacefully surrounded by a community that loved her. And her death, like Gabriel's, became teaching, demonstration that consciousness persisted. That death held no terror for those who understood its nature. That transition from physical to non-physical was gentle process, was returning home after a long journey, was cause for celebration rather than grief. The community continued, grew, spread, became one of many networks of awakened humans creating new civilization. And Gabriel's teaching, the truth about Jesus that Alien had revealed to priest and small church in mountains of Peru, became foundation of that civilization. Not because Gabriel was special, because truth was universal. Because once revealed, truth could not be concealed again. Because consciousness once awakened could not be returned to sleep. Because Jesus' actual mission, planted 2,000 years ago and carefully tended by beings across centuries, had finally achieved its purpose. Humanity had awakened, not all at once, not completely, but enough. Enough that trajectory had shifted. Enough that extinction was no longer probable outcome. Enough that transformation was assured. And somewhere in dimension beyond physical perception, Jesus watched and smiled and knew his sacrifice had not been in vain. That demonstration he offered had eventually been understood, that seeds he planted had finally borne fruit, that his return, promised but misunderstood, had manifested exactly as he knew it would. Not as king on throne judging humanity, but as recognition blooming in millions of hearts, not as external savior rescuing lost souls, but as internal awakening transforming consciousness from within, not as ending, but as beginning. The beginning of humanity's true purpose, of